Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The death of George Floyd at the hands of police in 2020 sparked protests and civil unrest. Communities of color questioned whether a bias exists among police. Recently, a report by the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California examined whether race plays a role in law enforcement stops in California. One of the co-authors of that report, Magnus Lofstrom, is with us today. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here, Mark.
So in 2015, well before the George Floyd incident, California passed a law called the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, or RIPA. My question is, why was that law passed in the first place?
Well, it was really part of broader efforts to increase transparency in law enforcement and our criminal justice system more broadly, and really a recognition of the need for data to inform, and research as well, to inform our discussions and policy decisions around criminal justice. And certainly one of the concerns there was bias in our criminal justice system and including policing as well. So
what aspects of policing did you examine in your report?
Well, so we used police stop data to examine the extent to which people of color have different experiences in their interactions with law enforcement. And the focus in the report is really on differences between Black and white individuals, although our research, our analysis extends into other groups and differences as well. And these experiences that I'm talking about are anything ranging from the likelihood of being searched while you're stopped, and then looking at whether the law enforcement officer found any contraband or evidence during that search. We examine differences in enforcement. And importantly, we also look at what we call the level of intrusiveness during the stop, which is really trying to understand, get a better sense of what that experience is. And that ranges to looking at where you at least asked to step out of a vehicle, assuming it's a traffic stop, to if the individual was being handcuffed, all the way up to use of force and involving an officer's weapon. So a broad range of experiences and one would have potentially with law enforcement.
And you're looking at like the city police, you're looking at county sheriffs, you're also looking at highway patrol, so different agencies as well. Just to kind of reiterate that. So where did your data for police stops come from? What was the source?
Well, so we really are fortunate here in California, as we are at the forefront of efforts to collect police stop data. So as a result of the RIPA legislation in 2015, all law enforcement agencies will eventually be required to collect the kind of stop data that we are analyzing here. And in this report, we use the most recent data available as a result of RIPA. And that includes close to 4 million stops that were conducted in 2019 by the state's 15 largest law enforcement agency. This is rolled out depending on the size of the law enforcement agency. And that includes, as you pointed out, the California Highway Patrol. It's 6 sheriff's department and 8 police department. It does include Fresno Police Department as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting also that these are police officers that are filling out these reports. So it's important to note that the data you're using is not made up data. It's coming literally from the police officers themselves. How do you define police stops, by the way?
So a stop here is defined as any detention by an officer or any officer interaction involving a search for a contraband or evidence. And I think it's also important to point out that these data, the mandates, covers both vehicle and pedestrian stops.
Yeah, I'm just wondering too, no data is perfect. There's a saying, garbage in, garbage out. Are there some shortcomings to this data that is being collected? I mean, it's being collected by police officers, but are there any shortcomings doing it that way?
Yeah, no, I think that there's no doubt that there's any data that we work on are going to have some caveats, and that certainly is the case. I think it's worth pointing out that these data that we're using here, they are really rich and they are unique. They include information on the demographics of the individual stop. That is anything from race, ethnicity to age, gender. It is as perceived by the officer. It has pretty detailed information about actions that the officer is taking during the stops, enforcement, as I mentioned, other ways to measure those kind of experiences that we're looking at. But even when it's rich like that, there are a few caveats to keep in mind, and you pointed out one of these at the very least, and that is this is as perceived by the officer, and the officer is not allowed to ask the person stopped to confirm what their perceptions are. They are also reported after the stop, and they're not corroborated with any other data source.
Okay.
So that's certainly. And then there's the other part is like any data that we use in research, there is a certain degree of incompleteness, that there are other factors that you feel are important in the kind of analysis that you're doing. And that certainly is the case here. For example, we don't have information on the officer's race and ethnicity or any details about the officer.
There's always ways to tweak it, right? But there's a lot of information that we want to get into in a moment. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Magnus Lofstrom with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California. He co-authored a report that examines race and the role it plays in law enforcement stops in California. So, Magnus, what does the data show? Are there racial disparities in the frequency and reasons for police stops?
Yeah, it definitely points towards that. And we see differences across race, ethnicity, in both the likelihood of being stopped, which isn't the focus of our report, but we also see differences in the reason for being stopped. So just some examples. If we look at the share of stops on Latinos and whites, they're roughly in line with the population shares in California. But when we look at Black individuals, they represent about 16% of the stops in these data, while they're only about 6% of California's population. So we certainly see disparity there, especially between Black and white individuals. And also the reasons, as you pointed out, you were asking about the reasons for stops, they vary as well. We see that most stops are for traffic violations for whites and for Latinos. That's about 86% of all stops. Mm-hmm. That's 75% for Black individuals. And instead, Black individuals are more likely to be stopped for reasonable suspicion. And that's about 21% of stops of Blacks, and that's about 12% for whites, for example. So there are differences in both of those aspects.
Yeah, I mean, and everyone, whenever they see a police officer behind them and the lights going on, it doesn't matter who you are, you're always worried. But obviously, Blacks may be worried for a whole different reason than maybe whites. What does the data show? Now, remember, this is data reported by police officers. What does it show regarding the outcomes of police stops?
Right. So if we look at the types of outcomes that we're looking here, which is trying to get a sense of what these experiences are like once you're having these kind of interactions with officers, we see that in a little bit over 10% of stops, the individual is being searched for contraband or evidence. And that in about 1/5 of those searches, they find some contraband or evidence. And the most common one is drugs. When we turn to the level of enforcement, which is also a focus of the report, most stops lead to some level of enforcement. 88% of stops, there's at least a warning that's issued, and in about 2/3, there is at least a citation is being issued. And then when you take the most serious level of enforcement, which is to be booked into jail, that's about close to 7% of all stops. And then intrusiveness, we trying to figure out how do we measure this level of intrusiveness. As I mentioned, we look at, well, you asked to at least being stepped out of the vehicle. That's about 17% of all stops. handcuffed, which is a serious level of intrusiveness, that's 8% of the stops. And then the most extreme level of intrusiveness is the use of force, something that involves an officer's weapon. That's relatively rare. It's a little bit less than 17,000 stops out of the 4 million. So 0.4% of stops. And in all of these outcomes, we're seeing racial differences.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me the use of weapons is so low. I had an uncle who was assistant chief of police in New Jersey, and through his entire career, I think he only pulled his weapon twice. So it's pretty rare. Let me ask you: does context matter here? Is that impacting the data?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's, what we're trying to do here is informing discussions about racial bias in policing. And I think when we think about this, it's important to take a step back and recognize that research that has looked at bias in a variety of settings, employment, occupations, housing markets, financial markets, it consistently finds evidence of racial bias. So from that perspective, it would be surprising if we didn't find bias among police officers as well. But as you point out, there are other factors as well that contribute to what those experiences are like. So we would expect if there is a stop for a traffic violation compared to one where an individual has an outstanding warrant out for an arrest, they're going to be very different, right? In one case, it's very likely to just be a verbal communication. In the other one, it's going to be a lot more involved, and including very likely an arrest and booking. So those kind of contexts are likely to matter when we are looking at these kind of experiences.
Okay, up next, we're going to talk about when a police stop occurs, what are the differences? And do those differences depend on a person's race or ethnicity? What does the data say? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Magnus Lofstrom with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California about a recent report he co-authored that examined the question of whether racial disparities exist in law enforcement stops. So Magnus, I was wondering about when someone's stopped by the police, what percentage of those result in a search of a person or property? And are there differences between how blacks and whites are treated in that regard?
Yeah, it's a little bit over 10% of stops lead to a search, but we're seeing notable differences across race, ethnicity, especially between black and white individuals. And for black individuals, the likelihood of being searched is more than twice that of whites. It's 20%, a little bit over 20% compared to 8% for whites. And that disparity really stands out compared to any other race, ethnic groups. But again, like what we're trying to do here is use, statistical tools to make adjustments for the factors that we talked about, how they might actually be impacting these disparities that we observe. And what we see there is that once we are making those adjustments for the various factors, the gap shrinks notably. It shrinks from 12 percentage point down to 4 percentage points, telling us the factors do matter.
So one of the factors might, excuse me for interrupting, but one of the factors might be like neighborhood, where the police are occurring, maybe the law enforcement agency, their mission. Do those things matter?
They are very likely to contribute to these things. Those are things that we don't have specific information on, but we do have, importantly, information on whether the stop is for reasonable suspicion or parole or probation, and those are very likely to have an impact on whether a person is being searched or not. So once we take all of those factors into account, that gap drops to 4 percentage points. So it has an impact, but still that tells us that Black individuals are 1.5 times more likely to be searched compared to white. Once you make all those adjustments, more of an apples to apples comparison.
Yeah. Okay. So what about contraband evidence? We talked about that a little earlier, found during a search. Is it more likely to be found based on who is being searched?
Well, we definitely, again, we're finding that race, ethnicity matters here to some degree, but not nearly what we're talking about in terms of the likelihood of being searched. It's about in 1/5 of all stops, the officer finds some contraband or evidence. But interestingly, the data suggests that Black individuals who are being searched, there's a slightly lower likelihood of finding contraband or evidence than for white individuals. And again, when we make those adjustments for factors and contexts, that gap actually increases. So it's telling us that given a search, officers are less likely to find contraband or evidence in searches of Black individuals compared to whites.
Yeah, I saw that in your report, and that was kind of surprising, frankly, given how many searches there are. Let me ask you this. So after a police stop, there's all kinds of actions that can occur, levels of enforcement, starting with at least a warning. Does a person's race play a factor in the type of enforcement action they're likely to experience after a stop?
Yeah, again, we're seeing that it does. And here, as I mentioned, most stops lead to some level of enforcement, but it differs. So for example, for white individuals, about 10% of stops lead to no level of enforcement. That's much higher for Black Californians. It's about 21% of those stops where there's no enforcement. Again, accounting for those contexts and factors, we see that they do matter. And once we take that into account, that gap shrinks from being, twice as likely to have no enforcement to about 1.4 times more likely to experience no enforcement.
Last thing I want to ask you, I've only got about a minute left here, but I want to ask you this about this level of intrusion. I mean, it can be limited anywhere from a verbal communication all the way to drawing a weapon. Does a person's race play a factor in the type of intrusion that occurs after a police stop? For example, is a weapon more likely to be pulled by an officer based on race? What does the data show?
It does show that if we just look at the raw data, we definitely see differences. Black Californians are about twice as likely to have an intrusive experience with police compared to white individuals. For the use, something that involves the officer's weapons, it's about 3 times more likely. Keep in mind, though, that these are rare instances, but still there are differences there. Context and factors matter greatly here as well. So there are big differences, but they do shrink once we adjust for that, recognizing those challenges officers are facing as they are engaging with an individual, for example, if you're seeing a weapon or not.
Okay, well, up next, if Blacks are having different experiences than whites when being stopped by police, what should law enforcement agencies do? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Magnus Lofstrom with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, who recently co-authored a report that examined the question of whether racial disparities exist in law enforcement stops in California. So, Magnus, after reviewing the police officer provided data, and again, it's important to stress that police officers were the ones that were recording this data. That's what we're using here. What is the takeaway? Are there real differences in the experiences that Blacks and whites have during police stops?
Yeah, I mean, the data clearly shows that there are notable racial inequities in police stops. And it certainly is a possibility that police bias may play a role and contribute to these inequities. But our analysis shows that other factors are relevant. The context, the type of agency, and where the stop is taking place, they do matter. But even though that we address those issues and concerns and adjust for it, we still find that there are inequities after adjusting for those factors. So putting that together, what I think it's telling us, it really, these findings, they do support concerns that are historically voiced by communities of color about inequities in policing, but also that some of these disparities that we see are driven by officer challenges and responsibilities when making stops. And I think it's well worth pointing out one more thing that we haven't had a chance to talk about, and that is that the greatest disparity we find are actually in stops for traffic violations that are made by local law enforcement, our police and sheriff's departments.
Yeah, I think one of the things too is this could actually be underreported data. It could be underreported by police officers in terms of they're taking down the data. There's no way to verify this in terms of is it accurate? You can't ask the suspect or the person to self-identify. So there are issues there. Some people think this may actually be underreported. So it's on the conservative side. Let me ask you this. So do these results suggest that law enforcement agencies should think about ways they conduct stops, or even if they should be conducting certain types of traffic stops?
Right. I mean, given that we are seeing higher search rates by lower discovery rates for Black individuals compared to whites, we see lower enforcement rates of Black individuals who stop than whites. It points towards that a disproportionate shares of stops of Blacks are unproductive. And that certainly is an issue that warrants closer look to better understand why that is. And then I think importantly, like looking ahead and for improvements, and these disparities are most notable in traffic stops, especially done by local law enforcement. That should raise this question of, to what extent can we safely reduce these types of stops? And maybe particularly looking at non-moving violations, such as improper display of a license plates, which is not an uncommon stop. And our point is not we should look for less enforcement. It's looking for alternative enforcement to traffic stops, because it is possible, if we can make movements to reduce stops, that it could reduce the risks and injuries to both officers and individuals who are being stopped, and at the same time reduce racial disparity.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so now since 2015, this law has been enacted and says, let's collect this data to see if there are any racial disparities. I'm wondering, this isn't in your report, but I was wondering to get your thoughts about whether collecting this data has actually made a difference. Is it resulting in, or do you think it's going to result in better policing practices, policies in California? I've only got about a minute left.
Well, I think the fact that we now can have discussions about racial disparity in law enforcement that are based on data and research is a clear step forward. And then I also think that it's, as we are showing here, is that these data can point us in the direction of where racial disparity is greatest. It allows us an opportunity to focus in and see if there are changes that we can implement that will lead to improvement. It is important to recognize that the data collection started relatively recently. The data that we're using, it's for 2019. It hasn't been that long, so we need to probably give it a little bit of time before we can see actual changes taking place. But it's very encouraging that we're having these conversations that are based on data and research.
And I think everyone can agree, we want efficient, effective, and fair policing in California. And certainly this data is going to help us get to that point. I want to thank Magnus Lofstrom from the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can log on to the Maddy Institute website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.